Okay, folks, ever feel like you're just completely overwhelmed? Like just bombarded with stuff to do? Deadlines and decisions, conflicts, big and small, just constantly popping up. And at the end of the day, you just feel wiped out.
I think we all feel that at times.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you've been putting out fires all day, but you haven't actually moved forward on anything that really matters. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's a really common experience, especially in today's world. You're right, we are constantly bombarded with information and demands and often pulled in so many directions, many of which don't really align with what we actually want to be doing or where we want to be going.
Right. It's exhausting. And that's actually what we're going to be digging into today in this deep dive. Um, you shared some really interesting material, particularly around this whole idea of picking your battles carefully. And this concept really resonated with me. I know it comes from the 33 Strategies of War, which I know you're a big fan of.
Huge fan.
Yeah, so this idea of being more intentional with your energy and choosing where to invest your effort for maximum impact, instead of just reacting to every single thing that comes your way.
Yeah, exactly. It's like shifting from that reactive mode to being more proactive and discerning, choosing your battles carefully. And it's not just about avoiding conflict altogether, it's more about being strategic, engaging in the right conflicts at the right time.
Okay, so strategically choosing our battles
Yeah.
instead of just fighting every single one. I mean, that almost feels counterintuitive, right? Like our instinct is often to address everything head on, to
Yeah.
sort of tackle it all. Why is this more selective approach actually more effective? What's the thinking behind that?
Well, I think one of the most fascinating things here is the idea of resource allocation. Because every engagement, whether it's a big disagreement or just a small little conflict, it takes something from us, right? It consumes resources.
Oh, absolutely.
Our time, our energy, our mental and emotional bandwidth, even financial resources sometimes. So by choosing our battles carefully, we're actually conserving those precious finite resources for where our input can really make the most difference.
So it's about maximizing our impact.
Exactly. Think about any successful entity, whether it's a company or an individual who consistently achieves their goals. They have this really impressive ability to focus their efforts. They don't spread themselves too thin across a million different things.
Mm-hmm.
They're really good at identifying those key areas where their engagement is going to yield the biggest results.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I think there's even like a physics analogy there, right? Where it's like a focused beam of light can actually cut through steel.
Right.
Whereas like a really diffuse light, even if it's brighter overall, doesn't really have that same impact.
It's all about focus.
Yeah. Now, one of the historical figures you mentioned in the materials that really stood out to me was Zhuge from the Three Kingdoms period. For those who might not be familiar, can you give us a little background on him and the challenge he was facing?
Yeah, Zhuge Liang was a brilliant strategist, and he was facing a really tough situation. A massive invading force was threatening his kingdom, much larger than his own army.
So a huge disadvantage right out of the gate.
Absolutely. And, conventional military wisdom at the time would have probably dictated meeting that enemy force head on at every single point, engaging in these potentially really devastating battles, right, to try to hold them back at every turn.
But that's not what he did right.
Exactly. He was much smarter than that, realizing that he was at a huge disadvantage in terms of numbers and that direct confrontation would be incredibly costly. Zhuge Liang chose to do something that seems counterintuitive. He ordered a strategic retreat.
Interesting.
But this wasn't running away in fear. This was a calculated move. It was all part of a plan. He was luring the enemy into a carefully constructed trap.
Ugh. Ah, the classic strategic retreat.
Classic, by not engaging on the enemy's terms right away. He was preserving his strength, his resources, his army for a much more decisive counterattack, when the time was right and when he had the advantage.
Okay, so like a classic ambush scenario. He basically flipped the script and turned that initial disadvantage into an advantage later on.
Exactly. And the result, he secured a major victory with minimal losses compared to what it could have been if he had just charged in right at the beginning. And this is a really powerful illustration of a key point that our source makes. Engaging in every single conflict isn't actually a sign of strength.
Right, it's not just about being the tough guy.
No, it can actually indicate a lack of strategic thinking. True strength comes from recognizing when not to fight, when to hold back, and choose your battles.
Okay, so we've seen this play out in a historical example with Zhuge Liang. In the material you provided, I noticed that you break down the benefits of this selective approach into three main advantages. The first being conserving resources. That one's pretty self-explanatory, right? You're not spending energy on every little thing.
It Seems straightforward, but it has a really important, deeper implication. When you consistently avoid these little drains on your time, your energy, your money, those savings accumulate over time and become a much bigger reserve that you can then use strategically to achieve the things that really matter to you.
So it's not just saving in the moment. It's about long-term investment.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. Okay, what's the second advantage?
Avoiding unnecessary enemies.
Ooh, that's a good one. And I feel like that's especially relevant today. With everything being so polarized, it feels like it's really easy to make enemies.
It is, and this is often overlooked, but it's so important. Even if you win a small argument or disagreement, that victory can come at a huge cost, especially in the long run. You might damage a relationship, alienate a potential ally, create resentment that lasts way longer than the original issue.
I've definitely been there.
Picking your battles wisely means looking at the bigger picture and making a conscious decision not to create unnecessary adversaries. Sometimes just staying silent can be the most powerful move.
Yeah, it's so tempting to just fire back a response, especially online.
Right.
But you have to think, is that little fleeting moment of satisfaction worth potentially burning a bridge?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's avoiding unnecessary enemies. What's the third advantage?
Maximizing power.
So how does fighting fewer battles actually lead to having more power? That seems a little counterintuitive as well.
Well, this goes back to the idea of focused effort and concentrated force. When you focus your energy and resources on a smaller number of truly important battles, you can achieve much bigger and more lasting results.
It's about quality over quantity.
Exactly. Each carefully selected battle that you win builds momentum, strengthens your position, and ultimately increases your overall influence. A few big wins are way more powerful than a bunch of small victories.
It's about making your actions really count.
Yeah, it's like creating a central point of strength from which all of your influence can radiate outwards.
That's a great way to put it. Now, in the material you provided, you gave some great real-world examples of this in action. Let's start with the business world. How does picking your battles apply in a corporate setting?
Well, think about companies that try to be everything to everyone. They try to enter every single market, or they offer a million different products and services. Often they end up spreading themselves way too thin, they lack focus, and they struggle to gain any real traction.
Right, they're not known for anything specific. They're just kind of there.
Exactly. In contrast, the businesses that succeed tend to be the ones that are very strategic. They identify specific niches, concentrate their resources, and become the best in those chosen areas.
So they're choosing their battles.
Exactly. They're not trying to win every single fight. They're focusing on the ones that matter most for their long-term success.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about leadership? We often think of strong leaders as being very decisive and, sort of taking charge in many situations. So how does this idea of being selective fit in with being an effective leader?
Well, truly effective leaders recognize that their time and energy are extremely valuable. They understand that getting bogged down in every little disagreement or every operational detail actually prevents them from focusing on the big picture stuff, the things that are really going to move the needle for the organization.
So it's about delegation too, right?
Absolutely. It's about knowing when to delegate, when to empower others to handle things, and knowing when to step back and let less important issues sort themselves out.
So a leader who's micromanaging everything isn't really leading effectively.
Exactly. They're not picking their battles strategically. It's about choosing to expend your energy and influence on the decisions and challenges that will have the biggest positive impact on your team and the organization as a whole.
Right, because ultimately those small battles might be won, but the war could be lost.
Exactly.
Okay, and then in our personal lives, I think we can all relate to this. How often do we get sucked into arguments or disagreements over things that, in hindsight, really don't matter that much?
All the time. It's incredible how much energy we can waste on these trivial disputes with family members, friends, even strangers on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
And these little battles almost never lead to any real resolution, and usually everyone ends up feeling drained and frustrated. So one of the key skills to develop in our personal lives is learning to recognize which arguments are simply not worth the emotional cost.
It's about protecting your own inner peace as much as anything else.
Right, and it's about prioritizing your most important relationships.
That makes sense. It's like that saying, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy?
Exactly. Sometimes choosing happiness means choosing to disengage from a battle, even if you think you might be right.
Okay, so we've talked about how this applies to business leadership in our personal lives. And one of the modern day figures you brought up who really exemplifies this principle is Warren Buffett. How does his approach to investing reflect this idea of picking your battles carefully?
Well, Warren Buffett is famous for being an incredibly disciplined and selective investor. He doesn't chase every hot stock tip or jump on every trend. He does his research very carefully and only invests in companies that have a strong track record, proven success, and what he believes to be a sustainable advantage.
So he's basically saying no to the vast majority of potential investment.
Yeah, he's extremely patient and waits for what he sees as the perfect opportunity. And that's a big part of his success. He understands the power of saying no to a fight. In this case, an investment that doesn't meet his very strict criteria.
So it's about having the discipline to wait for the right moment to act.
Exactly. He's not afraid to miss out on something in the short term if it means potentially achieving much greater gains in the long term.
Okay, so we've seen how this strategy plays out on a large scale. But how can we as individuals start to apply this in our daily lives? I mean, it's one thing to understand the concept, but actually putting it into practice can be a lot harder.
It can be, but I think the first step is to cultivate a more strategic mindset before you even find yourself in a potential conflict situation. Take a moment to pause and assess the situation. Think about what the likely outcomes are if you engage. How much will it cost you in terms of time, energy, and even money?
So basically do a cost-benefit analysis in your head.
Right. Ask yourself, is this really worth it? And does engaging in this conflict align with my overall goals and values? If the answer is no, then it might be a battle to walk away from.
That makes sense. And there's also this other really important factor that often gets in the way of making clear decisions in these moments. Our ego.
hmm
You know, it's so easy to get pulled into unnecessary battles
Yeah.
just because we feel like we need to be right or defend our pride or
Yeah.
react to some perceived slight.
Oh, the ego is a powerful thing, and it can really sabotage our efforts to pick our battles effectively. It wants us to win every argument, no matter how small or insignificant.
To prove a point.
Exactly. And I think the first step to overcoming this is just being aware of it. Recognizing that tendency in ourselves, that urge to always be right, even about trivial things. True strength is not about constantly trying to dominate in these little skirmishes. It's about focusing on what truly matters for your long-term well-being and success.
And sometimes the most powerful move is to simply disengage and walk away. Okay, so let's look at another historical example. In the material you shared, you talk about George Washington during the American Revolution. He was obviously facing a really daunting task.
Yeah.
The British were a much more powerful and established military force. How did he use this strategy of picking his battles to his advantage?
Well, if Washington had tried to fight the British using traditional European military tactics, he probably would have lost pretty quickly.
It would have been a very different outcome.
Right. He recognized that he couldn't win every battle head on, so he adopted a different approach, a much more strategic approach.
And that involved a lot of retreating, right?
Right.
Not engaging in those big decisive battles where he knew he was at a disadvantage.
Exactly. He used guerrilla warfare tactics, surprise attacks, and really only confronted the British forces directly when he had a clear tactical advantage. His goal wasn't to win every little fight, it was to wear down the enemy, exhaust their resources, and ultimately secure independence through attrition.
So it was a long game.
It was a long game and it was brilliant. And in the end, it worked. His careful selection of battles, combined with his willingness to retreat when necessary, played a huge role in the American victory. It's a really powerful example of how choosing your battles wisely can win wars, not just battles.
So it's not about brute force, it's about strategy.
Exact.
Now, there's a really important caveat that you mentioned in the materials that I want to make sure we address. The difference between strategic patience and weakness. That's a crucial distinction, right?
Absolutely. Choosing not to fight doesn't mean you're weak or afraid. It's a deliberate strategic decision based on a clear understanding of your goals and your resources. But there are times when a fight is unavoidable.
Right. Sometimes you have to stand your ground.
Exactly. When your core values are being threatened or the stakes are really high, you can't just back down. In those situations, hesitation or appearing unwilling to fight can actually be harmful. It can make you look weak and encourage your opponents to take advantage of you.
So it's about knowing the difference between a fight you can afford to walk away from and a fight you absolutely have to engage in.
Right. You have to be able to read the situation and understand what's truly at stake.
And when you do decide to fight, you have to be all in.
Absolutely. Half-hearted engagement in a crucial battle can be worse than not fighting at all.
Okay, now to illustrate the dangers of not picking your battles carefully, the material brings up Napoleon. He was obviously incredibly successful early on, winning a lot of battles and expanding his empire. but what ultimately led to his downfall?
Yeah, Napoleon is a classic example of what can happen when you let success go to your head and you lose sight of the bigger picture. Early on, he was very strategic, but as he won more and more battles, he started to believe he was invincible. He became overly ambitious, constantly seeking new conquests and engaging in more and more conflicts. And I think he lost that ability to step back and ask himself, is this battle really necessary? Does it serve my long-term goals?
He overextended himself.
Exactly. And the invasion of Russia is the perfect example of that. It was a completely unnecessary campaign. He overstretched his forces, underestimated the challenges they would face, especially the harsh Russian winter, and suffered massive losses. It was a turning point that ultimately led to the collapse of his empire.
So even someone as powerful as Napoleon ultimately failed because he fought too many battles. He didn't choose his engagements carefully enough.
Exactly. It's a reminder that no matter how strong or successful you are, your resources are always finite. If you keep fighting every battle, eventually you're going to burn out and make yourself vulnerable.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what are some practical steps that our listeners can take starting today to become better at picking their battles?
Well, the material provides some excellent questions that you can ask yourself before engaging in any conflict. First, is this battle truly worth it in the long run? What are the potential gains versus the potential costs?
Okay, so really weigh the pros and cons.
Exactly. Then ask yourself, am I conserving my resources by engaging in this, or am I depleting them? Think about what else you could be doing with that time and energy.
That's a good one.
And then think about the potential unintended consequences. Ask yourself, even if I win this battle, are there any hidden costs or new enemies I might create as a result?
It's about thinking beyond the immediate outcome.
Right. And then finally, am I truly committed to this fight? Am I willing to put in the necessary effort to achieve a decisive victory?
Mhm.
Because if you're not fully committed, it's probably better to walk away.
Okay, so those are some great questions for self-reflection. Now, there was one final example in the materials that I thought was really interesting, Apple. How does their approach to business reflect this idea of picking your battles?
Well, Apple is a great example of a company that has become incredibly successful by being very selective about where they compete. Instead of trying to create every type of electronic device imaginable, they focus on perfecting a few key products. The iPhone, the Mac, the iPad. They put all of their energy and resources into making those products the best they can be.
So they're dominating in a few key areas instead of trying to be everything to everyone.
Exactly. And it's working for them. They're consistently at the top of their game in those chosen markets.
Okay, so to sum it all up, the message here is not about being passive or avoiding all conflict. It's about being strategic.
It's about being smart and discerning and making conscious choices about when to engage, when to hold back, and when to simply let go.
It's about recognizing that your time and energy are precious and choosing to use them wisely.
Exactly. And by doing that, you can become much more effective in achieving your goals while minimizing unnecessary stress and conflict.
So listeners, as you go about your week, I want you to think about what we've discussed today. Is there one battle, big or small, that you can choose to disengage from? What could you let go of that would free up your energy for something more meaningful, something worth thinking about?
I think so.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.